In the waning light of a New England autumn, when the air grew thin and the leaves curled into brittle claws upon the soil, the townsfolk of Exeter whispered of the dead who refused to die. The year was 1892, but in that village it could have been 1692, or even the blackest century before time began, for fear had returned, ancient, bone-deep, irrational. It was not the fear of wolves, nor witches, nor hunger. It was the fear of the beloved buried, and the quiet certainty that they had come back wrong. This story is not a parable or a legend. This is what happened, and it begins with a coffin that would not stay closed. Mercy Lena Brown was 17 years old when she died, pale, coughing, shrinking by the day, until her bones rattled beneath the quilt. She had been watched by her father, George, who could do nothing but count the seconds between her breaths. She was not the first to fade. Her mother had gone years before, her sister Mary only months, and her brother Edwin was now coughing too, growing thinner with each sunrise. It was not coincidence, said the neighbors, not consumption. Something older, something moving between the bodies at night. George Brown, a farmer and churchgoer, had never believed in such things. But when Edwin began to scream in his sleep of a presence sitting upon his chest, cold and familiar, George went to the town elders. They whispered of an old cure, not one of medicine, but of tradition. One must open the graves. One must look upon the dead. And so it was that, on a frostbitten March morning, under the hollow gaze of a dozen neighbors and a doctor who had studied in Boston but now said nothing, they exhumed the bodies. The soil was still hard, and the spade trembled in George's hand. They found Mary long rotted, her bones clean as twigs. The mother, too, collapsed in her coffin, quiet and still. But when they opened Mercy's grave, her coffin, buried only 2 months prior and kept cold by the winter earth, they found her, unchanged, her body intact, her cheeks flush, her mouth, it was said, held fresh blood. They cut out her heart, burned it to ash on a nearby rock, mixed it with water, and gave it to Edwin to drink. He died anyway. This is not a ghost story. This is a story of what people do when nothing else makes sense. It is a story of what fear becomes when it wears the mask of love. And this was not the first time. For decades, some say centuries, this ritual had passed quietly through the corners of New England, particularly in Rhode Island and Connecticut, under the euphemism of preventing the wasting sickness. The old farmers knew, the church denied, but in barns and fields, by torchlight and trembling hand, they dug and watched and waited. The vampire of panic, they called it much later, when it could be mocked in journals. But the people who lived it would not have used the word vampire. They did not think in monsters. They thought in mothers, daughters, sons, and something cruel that had taken their names and would not let them rest. One such name was Sarah Talbot. She lived in Pomfret, Connecticut, a full generation before Mercy Brown, and her story, until now, has rarely been told. But it is her tale that tore her family into pieces, not from beyond the grave, but before it. Sarah had been strong once. Her husband had married her for her hands. They could carry twice the weight of any man, and she could birth a child without a scream. But after the 3rd winter and the 5th burial, she changed. Her skin dried, her hair fell, and she would stand by the edge of the fields and sing lullabies to graves that had no name. Her children began to weaken, first Amos, then Lily, then small Jacob, who never made it to his second name day. And the villagers began to look at her not with pity, but calculation. It was not grief, they reasoned. It was something darker. Sarah had become a conduit. They told her husband to act, that if he loved his remaining children, he must sever the connection. He must exhume the lost ones, and he must be prepared for what he would find. He refused. But one night in April, the townsmen came anyway, torches wrapped in pitch, spades slung over shoulders. They knocked down the door, held Sarah by the arms while the children cried. They opened the graves, found Lily's heart still soft. They burned it in the stove while Sarah screamed until her voice broke and her eyes would no longer shut. When she died a year later, it was said she had never spoken again. Her husband remarried. Her children grew. But the town never forgot what they had done, nor questioned it. What unites these stories is not madness, nor ignorance. It is desperation. These were people who had buried every second child, who saw death not as a stranger but as a constant dinner guest. When science had no answer, when God remained silent, they turned to something older. The idea that the dead might explain the living, that perhaps, just perhaps, one of them had not stayed dead at all. But it wasn't just in the farmlands. Even in towns with steeples and schools, with doctors and judges, the panic spread, always quietly, always behind closed doors. It is said that in Woodstock, a respected pastor's son was disinterred under moonlight, not by a mob, but by his own family, and that they wept as they did it. That the father prayed as he watched the heart burn. For when belief becomes unbearable, ritual becomes refuge, and when grief festers without outlet, it becomes hunger, and hunger always needs a face. The first grave was opened with trembling hands and eyes averted to the sky, as if heaven itself might strike them down for the desecration. Snow had just begun to melt on the stony fields of Exeter, and the earth, still stubborn with frost, fought them with every inch. But fear grants strength, and desperation grants resolve. They unearthed Merced Brown under a sky the color of old bruises, clouds hanging low and indifferent. Her coffin creaked like a whisper, and when it opened there she was, as if merely sleeping, cheeks still ruddy, lips still flushed. That was when someone screamed. It might have been her cousin, or her brother, or the wind. They had buried her 2 months prior, dead of the same wasting sickness that had taken her mother and sister, and now clung to her brother Edwin's chest like a parasite. But her body was not like theirs. It was untouched by rot. It was as though the ground had refused to take her, and in a time before germ theory, before X-rays and blood panels and understanding, the mind grasped for what it could. And what it found was the oldest, darkest elite found the vampire. But they didn't call it that. Not exactly. They called it the consumption, and they called her the one who feeds. The villagers, neighbors who once passed the Browns with a nod or loaf of bread, now crowded around with their faces turned hard as granite. One man suggested they turn her over to check for blood pooled at her mouth. Another said the heart must be cut from her and burned, its ashes fed to Edwin to break the curse. That was how it had been done in Woodstock, and in Manchester, and in the old stories passed down in the cracked, trembling hands of those who came from Europe long before. And so, beneath that bruised sky, and with no priest to stop them, they did just that. They cut her open. Her heart, wet and red as if it had only just stopped beating, was tossed onto a rock and turned to ash. They stirred it into a tincture and pressed it to Edwin's lips. He drank, he gagged, and he died just 2 months later. But you must understand, they did not do this out of cruelty. They did it because fear had become their god. This was not an isolated event. This was the culmination of a century's terror. In the small towns of New England, Rhode Island, Vermont, Connecticut, scores of families were torn apart not just by disease, but by the acts they committed to stop it. Corpses exhumed, hearts removed, ribs broken open. Sometimes they were burned, sometimes decapitated. In Griswold, Connecticut, the Ray family buried their dead in a crypt, only to return months later to find the bones rearranged, as though the dead had risen and fought within the coffin. When they opened the casket of one son, his body was upside down, skull shattered. They blamed no grave robbers, only the undead. This wasn't like the vampire of Today, the charming, velvet-clad seducer. These were creatures born of rot and sorrow. They were seen as invisible forces, spirits that fed on the living from the grave, draining the essence of their family one by one. Most were not feared because of what they might do, but because of what they already had done. They were blamed for the slow death of a household, the withering of crops, the screaming in the night. They were explanations carved out of despair. Doctors were no help. Few existed in rural areas, and fewer still understood what they were seeing. One might suggest fresh air, another leech, but none could cure the horror of watching a healthy man turn pale and thin, coughing blood into his handkerchief until there was nothing left of him. The sickness spread quietly, like a whisper passed from pillow to pillow, and left only shadows in its wake. It made monsters of corpses, and it made murderers of families. In the village of Manchester, Vermont, the Corwin family buried their daughter Rachel with great sorrow and ceremony. When her brother fell ill, they unearthed her in secret. The girl's hair had grown, her nails had lengthened, blood dark and syrupy had trickled from her nose. It was proof enough. They removed her heart, burned it to cinders, and fed the ashes to her kin. It did not save him. There was never salvation, only the illusion of it. But the illusion was often enough. In desperate times, hope wears strange masks. What they wanted, what all of them wanted, was control. against the unstoppable, the unknowable, the silent march of death. They craved a lever they could pull, a sacrifice they could make to put the world back in order. The body becomes a symbol, the flesh becomes a talisman, and when symbols fail, we blame not ourselves, but the one who looked back at us from the coffin. Too peaceful, too alive. In the eyes of the grieving, a dead girl with rosy cheeks is not a miracle. She is a warning, and yet not all participated willingly. There were always some mothers, brothers, lovers who clung to the corpse, not as a monster, but as a memory. In Wellington, a man named Joseph Brigham stood between the exhumers and his daughter's grave, shotgun shaking in his hands. He swore she was innocent, swore she was at peace. They beat him down. They opened her anyway. Her organs were burned. Her father died 6 weeks later, coughing blood. But the fever did not stop. Towns tried salt, garlic, witch bottles, charms buried at crossroads. They drew blood from the living to protect them from the dead. They smashed mirrors in sick rooms and scattered iron nails under beds. The rituals became increasingly elaborate, half pagan and half Christian, fueled by fading memories of the old world and the unbearable grief of the new. Yet for all the bone-cracking and heart-burning, there was no end, only silence, only the creak of caskets and the hum of wind through trees that had watched far too much. And always, it was the women who were blamed first. Too beautiful in death, too quiet, too pale, too perfect. Mercy Brown was not the first. She would not be the last. The dead girl becomes the scapegoat. The sister becomes the source. The mother becomes the monster. They say, now that tuberculosis was the cause of it, all that consumption was the slow drowning of the lungs in blood and fluid. Highly contagious and poorly understood, but try telling that to a mother watching her children die in sequence, one by one, each thinner than the last. Try telling that to a father who walks into the barn to find another child coughing crimson on the hay. In those moments, the truth is not enough. Only action soothes, only ritual heals, even if that ritual leaves a trail of desecrated graves and ruined memories. And so the ground of New England grew thick with ashes, thick with unspoken shame. But the stories endured, whispers passed in parlors, warnings etched into headstones. And as the 1800s gave way to the modern world, the rituals faded, the exhumations ceased, and the vampires were buried once again not in graves, but in the attic of collective memory. A memory too heavy to carry, yet too important to forget. And in the center of it all, Mercy Brown, the girl who slept peacefully, whose beauty in death damned her more than any crime in life. A girl made monstrous by time, by myth, by the need to find reason in ruin. Her name would live on not in legend alone, but in medical journals, horror novels, and whispered school tours through graveyards with tilted stones. The last vampire of New England. The final chapter, also they thought. The girl's coughing returned with a vengeance by the frost of December. A hacking, wet noise that echoed through the drafty wooden house like the distant rattle of chains in a crypt. Every breath she drew sounded like her lungs were being wrung out by invisible hands. And every night, as the family gathered by the fire, silence fell, not in peace, but in anticipation. They listened for it. The sound from upstairs, the death rattle that would announce that Mercy Brown had finally joined her mother and sister beneath the frozen earth. But she didn't die. She lingered. It was this lingering that twisted the townspeople's fear into certainty. They began to speak of her surviving not because of strengths, but because of something darker, something feeding her. They whispered that perhaps Mary and Sarah Brown had not truly passed on. Perhaps they were not dead in the way God intended. Perhaps something unnatural had taken root in their corpses and was feeding from Mercy's living warmth. The townspeople didn't need much convincing. There was already a stain on the Brown family, too many deaths, too close together. It wasn't just misfortune anymore. It was a sign. Providence, they said, or punishment. One man in particularly, Hawthorne, a farmer with bloodshot eyes and a Bible worn down to leather threads, became obsessed. He'd lost his daughter to the same wasting disease the year before, and when he looked at George Brown, he saw the cowardice of a father who refused to act. He who fails to sever evil, Elisha would say, allows it to fester in the bones of the innocent. He knocked on the Brown door one freezing January evening, hat in hand, eyes wild. "Let us dig," he said to George. "Let us find the source, or your mercy will soon follow." George was a broken man. He no longer protested. Perhaps because he was too tired. Perhaps because some small part of him, blackened by grief, had begun to believe it. And so, on March 17, 1892, under the dim grey sky of a Rhode Island morning, a group of men from Exeter took spades to the cemetery hill behind the Baptist church. The ground was so frozen they had to chip away the top layer with pickaxes. First, they unearthed Mary Eliza. Her bones crumbled, dry as dust. Then Sarah, the same, nothing but decay. But then they came to Mercy. She had been placed not with her mother and sister, but in a stone crypt above ground, the soil too hard to dig when she died in the heart of winter. And when they pried open the lid, they found her not, as they expected, not reduced to rot, but almost whole, preserved, her face still ruddy, her hair thick and tangled across her cheeks like ivy, her veins still held blood. Some swore they saw her move. Later, a doctor would say the preservation was due to the cold, that it was not so unusual for a body to keep in winter months. But no one listened. The men turned to each other, horror in their eyes, and Elisha spoke the words none dared. She is the one. What followed was not burial rites, it was ritual. They built a fire, tore out her heart, and burned it black. Then they mixed the ash into a bitter draught and gave it to Edwin, the only remaining son of George Brown, who had begun to cough, just like Mercy had. They thought this would cure him. He died 2 months later, but something had been released in Exeter that day, something fouler than any corpse, a precedent, a validation. It wasn't just an act of desperation, it became a story. One passed in murmurs from town to town, from graveyard to kitchen hearth, and with every telling, it grew. The Brown family faded from the newspapers, but the legend did not. 4 years afterward, whispers of consumption vampires haunted New England, in small, splintered towns where doctors were rare and coffins even rarer. Fear was currency, and grief its lender. Families began exhuming their own dead in secret. Signs were searched for. Blood in the mouth, flesh unspoiled, hearts that beat when no one watched. But the dead did not rise, nor did the sick recover. All that rose were flames and the choking smoke of burned hearts offered to a silence that never answered back. And yet, in the eyes of those who drank the ash, who buried their kin twice over, something always remained. Not relief, not peace, only the question. What if it had worked? What if Mercy truly had fed on her family? What if her heart held power? And what if, next time, they didn't burn it fast enough? They say history forgets, but it doesn't. It just buries things like teeth under the pillow of time, like hearts under frozen dirt, hoping they won't be found again. But the Brown family never stayed buried. Their story clawed its way back up, not as a warning, but as a legend, a blood-soaked tale told around campfires, stitched into local folklore, printed in yellowed clippings under headlines that read, "The Vampire of Exeter." In the years that followed, New England grew quieter, but never cut. The hills were still lined with frostbitten trees, their black branches like fingers pointing toward judgment. And in the silence, the people remembered not the truth, but the shape of their feet. They remembered the girl in the crypt, cheeks pink, eyes shut, mouth half open like she was about to speak. Mercy Brown became something more than a girl. She became a symbol of suspicion, of silence, of what a community will do when logic fails and grief turns inward like a blade. No court ever ruled what happened to her as a crime. No one was punished for the desecration, not for the fire, not for the blood, because everyone was grieving. And grief, in those parts, was a kind of madness no doctor dared diagnose. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, but there were ripples. Other towns followed Exeter's lead. In Woodstock, Connecticut, they disinterred Lemuel Ellsworth's children. In Vermont, a man named Corwin drank the ashes of his own brother. In Manchester, they opened 7 graves in a single night, their lanterns swinging like little stars over the graveyard. And in every case, the dead were blamed. Never the disease, never the poverty, never the bone-deep hunger for someone, anyone, to be responsible. The church remained silent. The newspapers reported with a slight curl of mockery in their typeface, but never too much, because they knew even those with ink on their hands were not immune to waking in the night and wondering whether the cough in their child's room was really just a cough or a warning. And in Exeter, George Brown lived alone until the end, a man whose entire family had been taken by illness or belief. When he died, his obituary was brief. It mentioned his service to the town, his years of farming. It did not mention the ritual. It did not mention that he had watched his daughter as heart turned to suit in the name of salvation. But in the graveyard, the crypt still stood. Years passed. The earth sopped, the town grew. But every winter, when the wind rattled the shutters and the frost painted its breath on the glass, some still walked past that cemetery and paused. Children dared each other to touch the crypt. Lovers whispered the name Mercy Brown like an incantation. And some, those who'd read too much or lost too many, felt a chill deeper than the cold, the kind that lived in the marrow. By the 20th century, Mercy had become a ghost. Not the kind that knocks over chairs or howls in the attic, but the kind that lives in a town's DNA. She was the face behind a folklore resurgence. Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, had clippings about her death in his notes. Scholars believe she helped inspire Lucy Weston-Ruther, doomed girl who returned from the grave with blood on her lips. And so her legacy spread like spores across oceans and decades. A girl buried in snow turned into a creature of myth. But what the books forget is this: Mercy never asked to be remembered. She never asked to be feared. She was a child of winter, a girl with a cough, a sister who died too young in a house filled with silence and smoke. It was not she who returned. It was the fear that resurrected her, and that fear of death, of disease, of the things we cannot control still lingers. It is quieter now. It wears different masks: conspiracy, misinformation, superstition, disguised as science. But it is the same monster, the same whisper that turns neighbors into accusers, the same hunger that says, "Burn the heart, and maybe we'll sleep tonight." So we tell ourselves it was the past, that we're better now, that we'd never desecrate the dead to save the living. But you only need one cough, one unanswered illness, one shadow at the edge of reason, and the spade returns to the earth, because some stories aren't just told, they are repeated, they are rituals, and the dead don't rest when fear is still breathing.